Life in the Trinity Ministry, in partnership with Brian McLaren, is pleased to present this series entitled The Storyline of the Bible.
We're going through the biblical story in 7 episodes, and we're in the 4th episode right now. Our first is creation, then crisis, then calling, and we're looking at this 4th episode that I'm calling conversation. Conversation involves dialogue. It means that there's somebody speaking and somebody listening, and that they trade roles as speakers and listeners. And the most essential part of this conversation is a conversation between human beings and God. Now, we tend to be very individualistic, and we just think about God speaking to me. But I'd like us to try to think about God speaking to us. In other words, every communication that God has with an individual can also result in that individual sharing that communication with other people. And in a way, then the communication with one is shared, and it becomes a communication with all. And in some ways, the idea of the Bible is that the conversations God has had with individual people, other people should know about. And then it becomes kind of a group and family conversation. And I don't want to make it sound like the conversation between humanity and God begins in this 4th chapter. In fact, each of the first 3 chapters involve a very vital kind of conversation. Maybe you never thought of it this way, but the creation story begins with a conversation. God speaks, and reality comes into being in a certain kind of response. You know, modern astrophysicists tell us that the universe is close to 15 billion years old, that the Earth has been around for something like 4 billion years, and that life has been around for just a couple of minutes on the biological clock, or on the clock of the universe. And in some way, if that's true, and I think we have every reason to believe it is, that tells us, first of all, it reminds us that time isn't the same for God, and I don't think God was sitting around looking at his watch, thinking, when is this thing going to finally produce some human beings? But I think what we have to understand is God actually, as the creator, takes pleasure in every part of creation. So the statement, God says, let there be light, and there is light, and God sees that it's good. Maybe you could think of it as if, God thought 6 or 8 billion years were in our time. That's just how much he wanted to just enjoy interacting with the light and taking pleasure in the creation of light. And you could just continue to go through the process of creation, that God speaks into creation. And when human beings are created, God speaks to them and says, you've got this whole garden. There's all these trees and all these creatures, and you can enjoy all of this. And says, I just want you to follow, one commandment. And God gives them a limitation to, in a certain sense, dignify them with the power of moral choice. And the book of Genesis says that the early humans walked with God in the cool of the day. And there's just this idea of maybe even an unspoken communion, but an awareness of the presence of the Creator, an awareness of the presence of the Spirit that hovers over the surface of the waters of creation. It's a beautiful picture. So conversation is going on there. It's a very beautiful, natural conversation. But then when human crisis enters into the world, we find God in conversation with the people. When in the story of Adam and Eve and Adam both take of the fruit and eat, God says, where are you? And why are you hiding? What have you done? And God enters into, he asks them questions, he gets them talking. It's so interesting. God doesn't want a monologue. And that's powerful for us to realize today. God doesn't want a monologue with us. He wants to hear from us. There's this invitation for creation to be active, and whether it's day and night and storm and sea and plants and seasons, and including human beings responding to God. God wants us to interact. And even in our crisis, God doesn't say, well, you disobeyed me, I'll have nothing to do with you. God asks us questions and gets us talking. He does it in the story of Cain and Abel, as we've seen. He continues the conversation. And then, of course, calling. One of the really important interactions between God and humanity is contained in this calling of Abraham. And God continues to communicate to Abraham, and then to Isaac, his son, and then to Jacob, his son, and then to Joseph, his son. So God continues to communicate through these first 3 episodes of creation, crisis, and calling. But then what we have beginning in the book of Exodus is a kind of formalized conversation. And it begins with this dramatic interaction between God and Moses. You find it in Genesis chapter 3. Now, Moses has been an interesting character. And we talked last time about the relationship between the called people and everyone else. It's not an us versus them relationship. And Moses is a great example because the Egyptians are insecure about the growing number of Jewish people. They have, in a sense, they have so many slaves that they're worried their slaves are going to cause a revolt. This is always the problem of empires. They conquer something and then they have to control it, and it's not easy to control. And so they start practicing a kind of genocide. They want to kill all the young male children. And Moses, as you might recall, his mother decides to defy this, and there's this beautiful story of these midwives who defy the empire's demand. And Moses is rescued by the daughter of Pharaoh. So Moses is raised in the house of Pharaoh. So he has this dual identity. He's part of the Egyptian culture, and yet he knows he has this special identity. And it comes to the fore one day when he sees an Egyptian beating up one of his own people, and he sides with the Jewish person, not with the Egyptian. And he actually kills the Egyptian, which now puts him in danger. And later he sees 2 Jewish people fighting with each other, and he tries to solve that problem. And then in that interaction, he realizes that the word has gotten out that he killed the Egyptian, and he realizes he's in deep trouble, and so he runs away and goes into exile. And isn't it interesting, this theme of exile? And the story never really settles down. And I think our lives, we feel that things never settle down for very long. So Moses is out, and he just must feel that his life just must feel that it's ruined. In a sense, he could make it as an Egyptian, as someone raised in Pharaoh's household, or he could make it as a descendant of Abraham. But in a sense, he's blown both, and now he just feels like he's a complete nobody in the backside of the desert, as the saying goes. And he's married a woman, and he's pasturing the flocks of her father. That's how the story begins in Exodus chapter 3. Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the desert and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. So this strange encounter. But the way God chooses to appear to Moses, who's going to become this great leader, but who right now feels like his life is just washed up. God appears to him as a flame, which is just such a fascinating image, isn't it? And isn't it interesting that God first appears in a visual image before God appears, before God communicates in words? I mean, we could reflect on that for a long time in terms of how this conversation works. God doesn't bang Moses over the head, or doesn't grab him by the lapel of his robe, and doesn't send down a document on a parachute. But Moses is in the desert, and he just sees this little fire, and he goes over, and there's something strange about the fire. It's not burning up the bush, and he begins to have some sense something's going on here. And it's in that context that he hears a voice come from within the bush. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, isn't it interesting? It's as if God is waiting for Moses' curiosity to then take the next step. It's a very gentle engagement in a certain way. And I think that seems to be the case in my own experience, maybe in yours too. There are things in life that if we let our curiosity be seized and we come over to take a deeper look, that's when the next step of the conversation develops. And God says, Moses, Moses. Moses said, I'm here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. I mean, this is something about the conversation. We're invited to come close, but we can't come too close. And there's a sense we're invited into relationship with God, but God never just becomes our pal. God never just becomes our buddy. Because there's this differentness about God. And this is a theme we're going to see through all the conversation from this very first primal encounter of Moses with God. Come close, but realize there is this gap, this difference between us as well. And it's associated with this word holiness. You're standing on holy ground. And the very idea of fire, we're drawn to fire. We're drawn to its beauty. We're drawn to its warmth. And yet if we come too close, we can't handle it. I just think that's a fascinating dimension of this conversation that we engage in with God. I feel that. I feel God calling my name. I feel God's presence. I feel God calling me closer. And yet there's always this awareness that I can reach out to touch God, but I can never grasp God in my hand. And we're going to see that same theme as the story unfolds. Take off your shoes. You're standing on your sandals. You're standing on holy ground. By the way, there's all kinds of meaning wrapped up in this image of taking off sandals. One might be that when you take off your sandals in the desert, you can't run away. Probably more significant, when you would go into the tent of another person, you would take off your sandals so you don't bring in the dust into the tent. And there's a certain sense that he's saying, take off your sandals. You're in my presence. It's like you're coming into my tent. You're coming close to me. Respect me, not as a force, but as, in a sense, as someone whose guest you now are. And then God says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And this is something primal about our encounters with God. In conversation with God, we start off with curiosity. We see this flame. What's going on here? And then we feel drawn, and yet we're aware of there's something a little scary about this. And there's something about our creatureliness that in the presence of the greatness of God, it's sometimes terrifying. I know I feel that whenever I think of God to some degree, but there have been a few times in my life when the greatness and majesty of God, I could feel it in such a way. I just felt that I would explode. I would melt. It was just this. It's just this awareness that the reality and greatness of God. Well, it's like a sound that's so loud you think, if I listen to this, it's going to blow my eardrums. Or a light that is so bright, or a flavor that's so delicious and spicy and sweet that you think if I eat too much of this, I'll never taste anything again. It's just this fascinating. It's this fascinating beauty and glory and majesty. Yet it's the sense that God is so real that our own reality is threatened if we don't respect it in the right way. I just find it so rich. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. Isn't this interesting? The first thing God says to Moses now is not something about Moses' personal life. I know you've had a rough day, Moses. I know you've had trouble finding a parking spot for your camel. I know you went through a tough time. It's interesting. God starts with his bigger plans in the world. It's a reminder. God's saying, I haven't forgotten the story that I'm involved with and the promise that I made to Abraham. I am the God of your ancestor, Abraham, and his son Isaac, and his son Jacob. And I haven't forgotten what's happened to my people who are now slaves. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. Isn't this fascinating? As God reveals himself to Moses. God reveals himself as a God who cares about suffering, cares about injustice, cares about oppression. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And so far it's all good news. And then God adds, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And I'm sure that would strike a little bit of anxiety because these were, these were significant tribes and people. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Now, in one sense, this is just perfect. Moses is the perfect guy. He was brought up in the house of Pharaoh. He knows the Egyptian language. He was perfectly prepared. And these 40 years that he's been living out in the wilderness, raising a family, it's totally apart from the political situation there. That time, I'm sure, has played an important purpose in his own formation and in seasoning him as a person, even though at the time he had no idea that this future was waiting for him. And now he's encountering God, and he's encountering a God who is faithful to his promises to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and a God who cares about injustice, cares about suffering. But it's very interesting. Moses' response now, whatever this encounter with God is, it's not what we would normally expect. I would expect an encounter with God, whatever God says, I would say, yes, sir, whatever you say, sir. But Moses responds, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And what follows now is a long argument between Moses and God. Isn't it interesting? The conversation so quickly turns into an argument. There's something beautiful about this, because Moses' descendants and the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are going to be known as the sons of Israel, and Israel was another name given to Jacob, or the Israelites. And that word Israel means wrestler or struggler with God. Now, the word Islam, we know, and Islam is a beautiful word. It means the one who is submitted to God. It means the people who are submitted to God. But isn't it interesting that the Jewish people are first called wrestlers with God? And Moses is fitting into this tradition. Abraham was in this tradition. There's this honest wrestling with God. And so the conversation is not just a boring conversation of giving orders and people saying, yes, sir. It invites pushback. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? I mean, don't you remember? I had to leave there in disgrace. I blew my chances there. God said, I will be with you. I mean, what powerful words in this primal encounter of Moses with God. I will be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Now, this is absolutely striking, because what God is saying to Moses is, he's not saying, look, I'm going to be this little glowing light, and whenever you look 3 degrees up to your right, you're going to see this glowing light, so you always know I'm with you. Or I'm going to give you this good feeling so that you're always going to feel wonderful. Nothing like that. But God says to Moses, here's how you're going to know that what this encounter with me right now is really real, and that this really is God. Because someday, this vision you're getting now of liberating your people, you will actually bring your people back to this mountain. My goodness, that relates to my own experience with God. Because I have felt at different times where I'm given hope and a vision for something God wants to do in and through my life. But then, in between that and its fulfillment, there are so many disappointments and so many setbacks, and the story is so messy. But then, years later, the fulfillment comes, and I just look back and I say, God, you were with me all along, and this is God's beautiful promise. I will be with you, there in Exodus chapter 3, verse 12. It might be a great promise for you just to take with you today. to understand that the God who has been in communication with human beings from the very beginning is a God who invites us into conversation. And he invites us first by just getting our curiosity, and then inviting us closer, and then we begin to encounter God. And God, we understand, has a big plan, a bigger plan than just our own lives. And he invites us to be part of this plan. And he invites us to do things that seem way too big and way too hard for us. And that's the context for this amazing conversation between a human being and God. You know, I hope today, and as soon as we finish this conversation, I hope that you'll be able to turn your heart toward God, and wherever you are in your relationship with God, that you'll just keep the lines of communication open. And maybe today you want to argue with God, or maybe today you're just curious to take a step toward God, or just say, God, I'm here. It's an amazing thing that we're invited into a conversation with God. In fact, let me close in prayer. God, you are a mystery too great for us to understand. We get an image of you when we look at fire. And it's dynamic and it's alive, yet it's not a substance. It's not something we can grasp. How different the image of fire is from the image of an idol made of stone or wood. It's dynamic, it's moving, it's alive, it's uncontainable. And then you confound even our understanding of fire, because here we have a fire that's burning, but it doesn't consume the fuel on which we normally would see it exist. God, you're an amazing mystery. And yet, somehow, we cannot help ourselves from being drawn into conversation with you, even though we know that you're greater than we can possibly imagine or understand. So help all my friends who hear these words today, and help me to live with our communication lines open to you, to believe that you're a God who desires to enter into conversation with us. Amen. Well, this is Brian McLaren for Wired Parish. Thanks, and have a fantastic day.
You've been listening to WiredParish.com. Visit us online for exclusive podcasts with some of the most challenging writers, thinkers, and speakers in the church. We bring you coffeehouse conversations with the best and the brightest. Tune in, turn on, get wired. WiredParish.com.